All right, in this part of the lecture, we're going to be building on where we were last time. Last time we established that Europe, following the Industrial Revolution, certainly had a distinct advantage technologically over the rest of the world. In particular, the dynamic that is new is an advantage over Old World powers, so-called Old World powers across Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. As we've established also in last class or last lecture, that while Europe had the ability following the Industrial Revolution to take over, it was not in that position prior. And in fact, who was in position prior was the Chinese. For most of the last 3,000 years, the Chinese have dominated in terms of the sources of technological superiority that would engender global supremacy. But China was not a global military power like Europe was during the colonial era. So as we established last time, we need to ask a different sort of question. Not just did it have the ability to take over, as if having that technology would be like, well, of course, if you have the technology, you're going to take over. Because China didn't take over. So it's not just if you have the stuff, you're going to take over. If you have the technology, you're going to take over as a matter of course. In fact, what we need to now look at, what we'll be looking at now, is why they would want to. What are the motivations to take over? And then what also are the moral justifications to take over? What narratives is Europeans telling themselves that would say it's okay to take over other parts of the world, and in fact, it's not just okay or acceptable or tolerable to take over the rest of the world, but it's right to do it. It's moral to do it. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. And I'd like to suggest to you that there are 5 principal factors that are both, to some extent, both a justification and a motivation. Some of these are more one than the other, and some of them are kind of a blend, both a motivating factor and a justifying factor. So as we look at these 5, I want you to think to yourself, is this a motivating factor or is this a justification? So the distinction that I want you to make is a motivating factor is one that is encouraging Europeans to express that ability by taking over. A justification is what are they, is this more something that they're telling themselves, oh, it's okay to colonize? So we'll look at these 5 one by one, but briefly here we have social Darwinism, so-called scientific racism, and belief in white supremacy. We have missionaries and the belief in religious and moral superiority, nationalism and political power, kind of a political competition. We have adventure and exploration, and the desire for individual wealth and greed. So looking at that first one, social Darwinism is an idea more attributed to Herbert Spencer than Charles Darwin, but Darwin, as we'll see in the next slide, subscribed to the thinking to some degree. So Darwin, as you likely know, put forward ideas connected to natural selection and evolution, and most famously in his book The Origin of Species, which came out in 1859. And the idea is that the idea of social Darwinism is that the same laws of natural selection that applied to plants and animals apply to people, groups of people, and so-called races. So the idea is, and we'll develop it here, that races are biological, one. So that is to say, races are real. That's central to this. They're not social constructs, according to this theory, and that some races are better than others. And as a result, as we'll see, it is natural, normal, for some races to dominate, just as it is natural or normal for some animals to be able to control an environment, to conquer an area, control an area in a way that other species can't. The point I want to emphasize here is that this isn't a wacko fringe view. This is the normative view. This is the popular view. This is common, so-called common sense during the late 19th, early 20th century. The weak are weak, and the strong are strong, and the strong will dominate the weak. We can see here at top right an image of Lord Salisbury, British political leader. Eat and be eaten is the great law of the political and animated nature. The nations of the earth are divided into the sheep and the wolves, the fat and the defenseless, and the hungry and the strong. Darwin below him, echoing similar ideas. Again, we shouldn't mourn the passing, therefore, if social Darwinism is accurate, we shouldn't mourn the passing of certain so-called tribal peoples, certain lifeways, whether they are indigenous Native Americans, whether they are Australian Aborigines, whether they're people in India or Africa. We shouldn't mourn famines that lead to their death. We shouldn't mourn loss of local lifeways, because that's the way of the world. Sorry about that. That's I'm at school right now. And below you see writings or ideas by Arthur Conan Doyle, who was famous for writing the Sherlock Holmes short stories. So that's an image not of Conan Doyle, but of a version of Sherlock Holmes. Conan Doyle had a kind of a pyramid, if you will. At the bottom, the lowest, were Africans, Australian Aborigines. Above them, other races. You get Slavic, Teutonic, Northern French. Can you imagine what's at the very tippy top? Yeah, it's Conan Doyle's people. It's English. And, the Irish would be lower down. So this is a real hierarchical framework. And it wasn't just their opinion. That is to say, they sought to ground it in biology and scientific objectivity. Some of these notions predated the findings of Darwin. These images come from a book called Crania Americana from 1839, so beating out Darwin by a couple of decades. And you can see here the idea that through comparative illustrations that really show that blacks, non-Europeans, are animal-like or not fully human. This was expressed through things like phrenology, craniology, where people bought different nose sizes, ear sizes, the shape of the head would all be indicative of intelligence, moral character, and so forth. I show this image because I think we've all watched some animal documentary, whether it's on BBC or with Richard Attenborough or something like that on Netflix. But imagine this scene. There is a herd of zebras by a lake. They're all around the lake, and they're lapping up some water, and maybe there's some nice music playing, and you think, oh, that's so cute. And then the camera pans over, and there's a lioness, or maybe a few lionesses, in the grass. And the music changes. And then there's the hunt. And the lionesses split the zebra pack and maybe pull aside, as we see in this image, a weak zebra, a young zebra, one that's not as fast or as strong. Now at this point, you may be thinking, run, little zebra, run, and you really wanted to get away. Or maybe you're rooting for the lioness because you're like, hey, she's got to eat too. Her babies, the baby lions, need to eat too. And you hope for the lion to catch a meal. Regardless of who you're rooting for, the zebra or the lion, you're not thinking, this is immoral. You're thinking, I want one side or the other to win, but not a moral question. And in fact, that is the parallel that social Darwinism is making, is that this is natural too. Imperialism, colonialism, the exertion of power by Europeans over people across Asia, Africa, the Middle East, Oceania, the Americas, is natural. Just as it is natural for the lion to hunt the zebra. And therefore, it's not immoral for the lion to hunt. It's not immoral for the European to dominate. And in fact, what is argued is that it is deeply moral, and Europeans are obligated to express power in this way because it is God's law. It's what God wants. God made the lion to hunt. God made the European to hunt, in this sense, in this metaphorical sense. So, in fact, by this logic of social Darwinism, it's not only okay to conquer other parts of the world, but as an expression of God's will. Fundamental to the colonial relationship between whites and people of color during the imperial era is the belief by whites in complete white superiority, technological, economic, military, moral. Now, I really want to emphasize here that this is not, this is a mainstream belief. This is a normative belief. And this is the common sense. This is the, well, of course it's that way belief. And this belief in white supremacy is propagated and maintained by the objectivity in science. It's popularized through images and art and culture, through the news. And then as people sit in this milieu of ideas that come at them from all sides, from science, from literature, from pop culture, if you will, then it's also the lawmakers sit in that framework as well, and then the lawmakers legalize and legitimize it, and it becomes structured into society in this way as it gets codified into law. Henry Louis Gates Jr., African-American scholar at Harvard, maybe you've seen some of his documentaries, like Finding Your Roots. He writes convincingly that these structures that support white supremacy, he writes in his book Stony the Road about this, and so his book's about Reconstruction. When we come to Reconstruction in late October, we'll return to this topic. But these beliefs in superiority are common sense. They are normalized, and they, everyday whites, whether they're white Americans or Europeans, are getting these ideas coming to them from all sides. So let's look at another piece besides social Darwinism, and that's missionaries. Missionaries in this context, we're talking about Christian missionaries, both Protestant and Catholic. A few points here. One is that the term associated often with this is the white man's burden, which comes out of a poem by Rudyard Kipling. You may know Kipling from his short stories, like The Jungle Book or Rikki Tikki Tavi. Kipling was born in India, is a white British person. So he writes this poem, and this term from it, the white man's burden, sticks. The idea is white people have a burden, a moral obligation to non-white people. So what's a burden? A burden is something that you have to do, but you don't want to do. If you're asked to, I don't know, wash the dishes, for example, and you don't want to, and you're like, oh, I don't want to. Well, that's a burden. You have to do it, but you don't want to. It's an obligation. You have to help a younger sibling or a cousin, and you don't want to. But it's the right thing to do, and it's part of your duty as a member of that family to do it. By metaphor here, there is a Christian duty, as it's seen at this time, to improve the lives of non-Europeans who don't have Christianity. The notion is, we have this good thing, it would be selfish to keep it all to myself. The desire is conversion, and the effect is that it taught native peoples around the world, that their religion or their religious system was wrong, and that there was this other system that is better. Missionaries are a really diverse group, and a lot of different types of people fit within this category, and missionaries played a wide range of roles within the expression of colonialism, the propagation of colonialism, but also the criticism of colonialism. Some missionaries were highly critical of European bureaucrats, of government officials, of government policies, and those policies that hurt local peoples. So they were highly critical in India, for example, but also in Congo under King Leopold II, highly critical of government policies. So regardless of their intent, again, the goal for all of these missionaries was not to screw over local people, but to help them. Regardless of the intent, however, the effect of missionaries led to an insertion of colonial power far from urban centers, as we can see in this image here in rural Africa. The effect of missionaries led to the insertion of colonial powers far from urban centers and led to major cultural changes in local populations. It led to a shift away from traditional lifeways, economic systems, religious systems, medical systems. And we'll come back to this topic again. I want to show you an image from an American journal called The Journal. And you see at the bottom here, the white man's burden. Can you pause it at this time and have a look at this image and think about what you see? What you should see is a man labeled US, so the United States, and by the hat and the clothes, sure looks a lot like Teddy Roosevelt. And this image is coming from that time period, right around 1900. And we see some ships with an American flag at the coast, and atop, also with the American flag, the word schoolhouse. Judging by the trees, and it has a tropical environment. And this schoolhouse, this man is Teddy Roosevelt, is carrying up to the schoolhouse this caricature of a man, I'm going to assume, from the Caribbean or the Philippines. This man doesn't want to go, isn't going themselves. And Teddy Roosevelt, at great personal effort, going uphill, is taking this person here. So it's a burden. It's hard for Roosevelt, but he's doing it because he's helping the local peoples. They're little black brothers, as sometimes the literature refers to them as. So this is actually a useful primary document to see the thinking at the time of an expression of the white man's burden. Let's go on to another topic. This time period was one of a lot of described adventurers and explorers. Think of like Captain Cook earlier on. And a lot of these, like missionaries and traders, these individuals went to locations before the state, before the government. So whether we're talking about coastal or island locations, but also, as we see in this image here at right, but also deep into the interior. Perhaps you've heard of Stanley and Livingstone in Africa, for example. The idea is these individuals may be going for scientific reasons, perhaps seeking to catalog a record of plants and animals. This is also an era of the growth of natural history museums that are popularizing or introducing to everyday Europeans exotic locales, the desire for oddities and curios from faraway exotic places. And these individuals are coming back with these, I don't know, strange animals, so-called strange, I'm putting this in brackets, strange animals and plants, and even, in some cases, indigenous peoples were brought back and literally put into zoos where Europeans could come and see black and brown people from other parts of the world as if they were animals themselves. But this was, again, seen as not imperialism, but science. It was, fun times to be had by rich. And as the items came back in filled natural history museums and zoos, it was excitement for the lower classes of Europe, too. This was also, we should take note, a way for European states to compete against each other. By having Livingstone, for example, and Stanley explore into the source of the Nile, for example, this could be a way for one European power to say, this part of Africa is our part of Africa, not your part. So by these adventurers and explorers are establishing footholds and legitimations in the eyes of European legitimations of control. We control this area. Our explorers have charted out all these islands. Look at these maps we brought back. This is ours. So this is a form of intra-European competition, which brings us to our next point here of political and military nationalism. Part of what we're seeing here is this competition of European states for their mother country, a way of promoting national goals and colonies as a source of power, a source of raw materials, a source of prestige for the colonies. Pardon me, a source of power for the European states. Most of you perhaps are already familiar with the term the scramble for Africa and the Berlin Conference. The Berlin Conference of 1884, which stretched into 85, is, I'll show you this other image here, is where Africa was carved up, and the phrase was, it was a magnificent African cake. And it was as a result of this conference, this treaty ceremony that went on for some months. 17 states, including the United States, were there. The idea was that they would draw lines on a map. It's worth noting that not a single person there was African. Not a single person there had actually even been to Africa. And they were all men. I think maybe, unfortunately, needless to say, they were all men. They were all European, and they had not been to Africa. But this doesn't begin African exploration. This is actually a kind of, might be useful to think of it as a kind of a peace treaty. And it is to fend off competition or conflict that may arise deep in the interior. If one so-called explorer or trader or merchant is in one part of Africa and they think, this is mine, this is an area that I have control over. And then a French or Italian or German or Portuguese is there and has the same thinking. This could inadvertently lead to conflict or war. European leaders really just wanted to fend off war. Their goal, let's make as much money as we can. Let's kind of utilize Africa as a resource. But we don't need to fight about this. We don't need to fight each other. And as a result of this partition, it really made the draining of African resources safe for Europeans because due to the technological advantage, the threat of wide-scale military losses was lessened because they're not fighting other Europeans. Let's come now to our last major cause, and that's wealth and greed. Many historians, like Ibram X. Kendi, has argued in his book Stamped from the Beginning, has argued that profit motive came first in colonialism. Profit motive came first in enslavement. And everything else was back-ended justification to make this rapacious theft justifiable. So the desire for money, for greed, individual economic gain came first. William Dalrymple, a Scottish historian, convincingly argues in his book, The Anarchy about the East India Company, that individual profits came under the auspices of colonial states, and these individuals, whether they're bureaucrats or soldiers or traders, they stole under the threat of violence against colonized people for themselves. So they're not bringing money back for the European state itself, not for France or England, but for themselves. It's important to remember or to take note that a lot of these bureaucrats and traders and soldiers were not aristocrats. They're not wealthy of Europe. They're, I hate to use the phrase regular people, but they're what would be like a head of the post office in some town in England, and when they're in India or Africa, they, through the auspices of colonial states, through the threat of military power, they have themselves a lot of power, and they are therefore in a position where they can force local peoples in such a way that they make a lot of money. So I'll give you the example of Robert Clive of India. We'll come to this next week. He becomes terrifically wealthy himself as a result of basically draining the coffers of India for himself, not for Britain, but for himself. If we look at India's GDP prior to the Raj, prior to British rule, it's 22.5% of global GDP, global wealth, right? Gross domestic product. Britain was generating about 1.8% in 1600, and at the peak of the Raj, those numbers are reversed. So we'll develop this as we go forward, but the idea here is that this is a get-rich opportunity that had not existed in Europe prior. Prior in European history, if you're rich, it's because you've come from the right aristocratic family. But now, all of a sudden, due to the Industrial Revolution, a new class of people can get wealthy. There are a number of other growth factors for colonization, and I just want to tick through the ones left pretty briefly. As a result of the Industrial Revolution, people are moving from the country into the cities, into pretty harsh urban conditions with unstable employment, poverty, homelessness, and social displacement. So it's not great living, honestly, in Europe, especially in Britain. Britain industrializes before the rest of Europe. It's not great living. And if you have the opportunity to leave the polluted town of, say, Liverpool and go to India or Africa, potentially you would take it. Or to Australia, you would take it. There's also great population growth, and so there's this so-called surplus population, a baby boom, if you will. And so, again, this is a motivation for people to go elsewhere. There's an economic downturn, again, encouraging people to go elsewhere. The national security piece there is that there are areas that become controlled, not because they themselves are enriching, but they are the key to maintaining colonies, for example, in India. So the Suez Canal, which connects the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean in Egypt, is important. The Horn of Africa, because of the shipping lanes. Cape of Good Hope, same thing. And we've already established that there are motivations in the rest of the world that allow for Europeans to want to go there. I'd like to end here with a reflection, an opportunity for you to write. We've looked at a lot of motivations and justifications, and we've seen already that having the ability to conquer isn't enough. There needs to be a mental framework that not only condones conquest and subjugation and theft and forced cultural change, but in fact makes it in the minds of Europeans moral, that makes it in the minds of Europeans necessary. So I want you to write in your notes the answer to these questions, or at least your understanding of your answer to these questions. And if you don't, if you're like, I don't quite understand this, good. Take note of what you don't know and come to class with that question, and we'll see if we can unpack it together. So go ahead and pause here and take some time to write. All right, this wraps up this section.